Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining me here today at Re-Written Vintage Homestead in our At Work edition, where we are on chapter 4 of the Dollmaker, the beautiful book by Harriet Arnow that takes place during World War II in the Appalachian Mountains. To recap chapter 3, we met Gertie's children, and my favorite is little Cassie Marie. Cassie is developmentally slower than her older brothers and sisters, and to cope with that, she has an imaginary friend named Callie Lou, and she uses Callie Lou to deal with everyday stressful situations and just to play with when she's lonely. Another one of my favorite characters is Reuben, the older boy. Reuben's a country boy. He loves to hunt. He loves to fish. He's a hard worker. He helps his grandparents and his parents. And we're going to learn a lot more about Reuben as the book goes on. But Reuben is a lot like Gertie's brother who passed away in the war, Henley. Henley gave Reuben his shotgun, taught him how to carry it, and taught him how to hunt. And the family is grieving at this point for Henley, who passed away in the war. So let's go on to chapter 4, and we're going to meet Gertie's mom, and we'll learn a little more about her. Cassie ran ahead of her down the long slope of the pasture field. Gertie stood by the rail fence and watched her grow smaller and smaller, but always a child running until she disappeared behind the new barn that Henley had built to hold his tobacco. The barn was empty now. The old barn that held the hay and his black beef cattle was empty too. Suddenly, the timbered hills, the fields rolling down to the river, the white painted house with its 2 stone chimneys, the barns with their smaller outbuildings huddled about them, all these were no longer as they had been. When she was a child, her father's place in the valley with its fenced fields, many of them green with bluegrass, had seemed a world of its own, richer, flatter, greener than any other farm she knew. She had married and learned the chaos of yearly moving and the struggle to make corn grow. Never all on your own, on the thin, worn soil of sandy ridges. Her father's farm with Henley running it had seemed finer still. Now the ragged, uncut hayfields, the pasture, empty of cattle, the beginnings of a gully in the pasture, the field below her, all cried out to her that her father was old with a crippled leg and that Henley was dead. She hesitated a moment longer, looking down, and then her eyes, bleak and gray, her mouth like a gash across her face, she strode on. Stopping only after she had gone onto the screened-in side porch where the family ate in summer. She stopped just past the porch door and stood, looking at first one and then the other of the 2 doors. The door on the end opened into the kitchen. Her father might be there. The other led into the new part of the house that her mother had built when she came there as a bride. Intended for a dining room, it had, through the years, become her mother's room, the center of her mother's kingdom of crochet work and potted plants. Cassie called from around the house, "Mom! Mom! Grandpa's out in the blacksmith shop!" And she ran back to her grandfather, expecting her mother to follow. Gertie, with an uneasy glance at her mother's window, turned swiftly, soundlessly, and opened the porch door she had just come through. Her foot was on the second step when there came a wailing cry behind her, and her mother rushed onto the porch. "Oh, Gertie, 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 your own born brother dead in a foreign land, and never once did you bother, did you come to comfort your poor old mother, weeping her heart away. And when you do come, you ain't so much as come in and speak to your poor dying mother," she said. And her mother stood on tiptoe, caught her around the neck, kissed her wetly on the cheek, and fell to weeping on her shoulder. Gertie stood like a stone woman, only her hands clenching and unclenching with the effort not to shiver at her mother's kiss. In a moment, the older woman's sobs had subsided enough that she could speak again. "Oh, Gert, how could you do me this way? Your sister Meg has been so good and kind and has written me so many letters and is aiming to come and see me at Thanksgiving when her man has an extra day off, all the way from the mining town. Meg will come for a day or two just to see her poor mother. But you..." And for the first time, she lifted her head and looked fully at Gertie. Gertie looked back at her face, pale beyond any face she knew, almost never touched by the sun or the wind, seemingly always close to death and to God. The eyes so big and dark and sad below the pale forehead, the eyebrows black by the little weak white hand that rubbed them now in an old gesture of suffering. Gertie watched, unable to think of anything to do or say, and while the hand rubbed the forehead, went back and up into the dark, ungraying hair, then dropped suddenly and lifelessly while the head bowed slowly, eyes closing. Her mother leaned an instant, weakly against the house wall, and then slowly, as if in an effort were very great, she straightened, but still tottering, and she turned toward the front door. Gertie watched her, clenched hands tight by her sides, the muscles in her thin cheeks corded over her clenched teeth. Her mother was going around to the front door that opened into the parlor. The organ she used to play when Henley sang was there, and on the wall above it was his guitar. "Please, Mom, let's go sit in another room." Mother turned and looked at her with curiosity. "You sound like you've been a-running." "Well, I hurried kinda," Gertie said, her voice hoarse, sullen sounding, defiance in her step as she turned back to her mother's door. "Hurried," her mother was shrilling, beginning again to weep. "3 weeks since the word come of poor Henley, and I've had such a time, and everybody else has been so kind but my poor child. They got me through the fainting spells somehow, but from God alone can I be reconciled. I wish I could believe like them that Meg read about in the mining town, and like you, if you believe anything. They've got some of them in jail, Meg writ. They go around a claiming they ain't no a burning hellfire, that our God would never allow it. And at that very worst like them, that Henley will only be destroyed, but oh, Jesus, he is kind. But it says, the Lord thy God am a terrible God. And on the last God, her voice rose in a terrible wail of weeping as she looked up at her great daughter, who stood now as in childhood when her mother wept or scolded, silent, high-headed, straight-shouldered, stony-faced. It seemed a long while before Gertie could think to open the door, and in a voice which was hoarse and harsh, instead of gentle-sounding as it should have been, remind her mother that she might catch cold running out, as she had done in nothing but a little crocheted cape around her shoulders. Her mother refused Gertie's hand on her elbow, but by clinging to the door frame and then seizing a chair back, she managed to reach the rocking chair reserved always for her on one side of the fireplace. "And what mightn't a terrible God do?" she moaned, fighting and flinging her head against the back of the chair and looking at the ceiling. "I can't bear to think it. Henley, my onlyest son, a-flaming there in hell. He never found that narrow gate, oh Lord, that little narrow gate to eternal salvation and life everlasting. But he followed that broad road straight to perdition, a-dancing and a-drinking his drops. Infinite justice, infinite mercy, let me be reconciled. Seems like it'll kill me. How could God do this to me?" "It was Henley he done it to, Mom," Gertie said, and added, "He broke none of the 10 Commandments." She had stopped just inside the door and stood rigidly still, her shoulders hunched a little, her hands clenched at her sides, almost with the air of a frightened and defiant animal dragged into the warm, overcrowded room against her will. Her mother made a little business of straightening her head and looking at her, a flame of something close to hatred burning in her tear-wet eyes. Maybe if it hadn't been for you, Henley would have given himself to God. You was the oldest. He thought a sight of you too much. I always thought that at the time. He's seen you stand stiff-necked and stubborn in the face of the Almighty God. You never repented for your sin of dancing. If you and your father too, but mostly you, had set Henley a good example, he might have been a-singing into heaven right now. The rocking chair gave an angry, impatient creak. What are you standing there glaring at me that way for, mad as fire? Seems like you've been mad about something ever since Henley went away. I reckon you wanted me to lie and say Henley was our sole support, but he wasn't. Pop ain't been able to do heavy work since, Gertie began in a low voice. She stopped when her mother's head fell upon the chair arm and she began weeping again. Words of heartbroken moaning mixed in with the weeping. Oh God, thy ways with my children are past understanding. She was silent then, the chair still, bowed head slipping slowly off the chair arm towards the floor. Gertie could only twist her hands and stare at the sagging figure and back away. She did lift one hand to catch her mother's shoulder, but it jerked back. Her mother would shrink from her touch and shrug her hand away, as when she tried to help her through the door. Her frantic glance, quite by accident, struck the camphor bottle on the mantel. She seized it, held it towards her mother, meanwhile begging in a hoarse and broken voice, "Please, Mom, please, try your camphor." In other words, please, Mom, shut the hell up. Maybe it'll keep you from a-fainting. Her mother reached blindly without lifting her head, and Gertie put the bottle up to her hand. Gertie watched concernedly as she sniffed and revived enough to speak. "Gert, I reckon you wanted the whole neighborhood, especially them like your mother-in-law, the old Kate Neville's, with her 3 boys gone and Clovis called, to go around and throwing off on me, a-saying I kept my onlyest one at home and tied to my apron strings." Gertie opened her mouth and then closed it. She was silent, staring at the fire while her mother gradually gained strength enough from the camphor to sit up and say with a little head shake, "You ought to read your Bible, Gert. It's all foretold. 'I come not with peace but with the sword,' Christ said. And recollect how in Revelations it tells us we can't buy or sell by the mark of the beast. That means these ration cards. They've got the beast number on the mark. Christ is a scourge in the world like he scourged the temple, and in his mighty wrath he... But Mom, maybe," Gert began in a low, hesitant voice, turning to look at her, "maybe there's another side to Christ. Recollect he went to the wedding feast and he had time to fool with the little young'uns and speak to a thief and a bad woman. Henley was like Christ. He worked and he loved his fellow man," and her mother's rocker gave an angry swish, and Gertie, whose voice had grown ever lower and more hesitant, fell silent. She looked past her mother through the open door, her eager glance hunting up the hill pasture path she had walked a few minutes before, and then pausing on the brow of the hill where the woods met the bright blue sky, and for an instant it seemed that her Christ, the Christ that she had wanted for Henley, was there, ready to come singing down the hill. A laughing Christ, uncrowned with thorns, and with the scars and the nail holes in his hands all healed away. A Christ who loved people. He had liked to mingle with them and laugh and sing the way Henley had liked people singing and dancing. That was Christ. He walked down the hill now and stood by the door asking to be let in. But it was Henley's home, and he knew Henley. He wasn't there, of course. It was only her mind that made this Christ live, the way Cassie made the witch child, Callie Lou, alive. or gave life and heart to a piece of hickory. She jumped and then strode with awkward quickness toward the door. Her mother was shivering and exclaiming, "Gert's no wonder Amos like to die with the croup if you don't shut the doors at your place no better than you do here." Gertie opened her mouth to say that croup was a disease Amos had caught, but she tramped on her tongue in time. She closed the door soundlessly, as she had been taught to do as a child. Forgetting to take off her coat, she sat down on the edge of the split-bottom chair, a good distance back from the fire. She tried to recollect at least one of the many things she had planned for talking about with her mother, pleasant things that would take her mother's mind off of Henley and hell. She couldn't remember them now for wanting to ask about her father, but she dared not show too much concern for her father too soon. She was glad when her mother broke the silence, saying with a sorrowful shake of her bowed head, "Gert, I always say let a body believe what the Bible tells them to believe, but you're mighty close to being an infidel. You're bad as them people Meg's writing about in them coal mining towns. They're claiming come Armageddon this world won't be destroyed by fire and brimstone from heaven, like the Bible says. Some of them got put in jail for not saluting the flag, claiming it was a graven image." Gertie's head came up and she looked quickly at her mother. "They can't put them in jail. The Constitution says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or—" "Gert, Gert!" her mother cried, more angry now than ever. "Don't you know there's a war going on and things is different? If religion is unpatriotic, it ain't right. Your pop would learn you the Constitution and some of the Bible, and you've been a-spouting them ever since like you was a preacher and a lawyer too." Her mother began sniffing the camphor again, and Gertie, desperate for conversation, said quickly and in an unnaturally loud voice, "Mom, how's that pain in your side? Clovis was a-telling me you been mighty bad with that old pain." "Gert, darling, do I matter so little you can't even recollect what hurts me? It's not that old pain that had come after the boring you that nearly killed me." She sighed a moment in the remembrance of Gertie's birth and then continued, "I'm mighty bad constipated, mighty bad. Soon as I get a little stronger and afore they take Clovis for good, I'm going to get him to take me to that doctor in town. That doctor where you took Amos, it's got so his medicine don't do me a lick of good no more, not for my constipation. I don't think he's as good as that little doctor at the Valley. He went off to war right away. Your doctor's a slacker and he's unpatriotic, or he'd have gone already. But people's got to have a doctor. I don't believe Amos could have." Her mother was sniffling again, and her head was bending toward the armchair. "Gertie, Gertie, if you lost a son like me, you'd know there was a war going on. Amos just had you scared. Clovis said the hole in his neck wasn't bigger than a marble. After my poor Henley went and gave his life, I feel that every man—" "God didn't give Henley his life to give away, and he didn't give his life. They took it from him. He didn't—" Her mother began to weep, and Gertie realized she was saying things she had made up in her mind not to say. She looked about the room, hunting desperately for something to talk about. But the room seemed as if it had been since her childhood, forever crowded with things she had seen many, many times, but forever alien territory that had from the beginnings of her memory made her seem even bigger, even uglier, more awkward, more liable to break something than she had seemed in other places. Here and there on the walls, in the little wooden shelves contrived by her father, covering the low window sills set on the cedar chest and on the center table, and crowding Henley's picture on top of the phonograph, were her mother's potted plants. Geraniums, begonias, varieties of cactus, coleus, sensitive plants. Many were blooming, but in a sad, half-hearted way, as if they were tired of the red clay pots tied with crepe paper that crammed their roots like too tight shoes. A whole corner of the large room was taken up with a large piece of furniture built by her father. It had 3 broad steps rising on all 4 sides, each step wide enough to hold a row of potted plants, with the small square on top holding the king of her mother's plant kingdom, a giant fern that seemed to have changed little since Gertie first remembered it. She had memories of trips to the woods for the black, rich earth from generations of leaves dying on limestone ledges, for the dirt must be scraped from a damp limestone ledge where other ferns grow, so that every few years the plant had to be repotted and divided, with rooted fronds growing out to all the neighbors. Not long after her marriage, her mother had given her a good-sized piece of it, rooted in a large red pot. She had on the way home stopped by a limestone ledge above the creek and set the fern where it belonged to be. Hanging from ornamental pegs whittled by her father for her mother could never abide a nail in her wallpaper, were innumerable pincushions. Some were of patchwork, and others in the shape of knitted or crocheted hearts and stars, and diamonds run with pale blue or pink ribbon, faded now into dusty grayness. There were old almanacs advertising remedies for female troubles that had plagued her mother so much since Gertie's birth. There was a great watch that had come down to her father from his grandfather, a never-used powder horn filled with 2 crepe paper roses brought home 9 years ago from Uncle Christian Blue's funeral, alongside an unframed, faded picture of Joshua blowing his horns by the wall of Jericho. Everywhere on the dresser, the mantel, under the giant fern, on the chair backs, the curtains, the sewing machine, the cushions, were samples of her mother's handiwork. Covers, scarves, doilies, all starched and ironed until they seemed of the shiny, stiff coldness of metal, when a bit of one could be seen between the medicine bottles, clocks, lamps, and vases of artificial flowers that surmounted them. They somehow matched the floor, laid years ago with one of the first linoleum rugs in the settlement, so fine that for fear of spoiling it, her mother had put a rag carpet over it. And over the carpet, new then, and one of the last to come, from old Aunt Sarah Kramer's loom, lengths and pieces cut from the old red turkey carpet that had been in the front room when she came to it as a bride, and over the old carpet, to brighten it a bit, small rugs she had from time to time ordered from Montgomery Ward. One of these depicting a very pink-faced little girl with overly large eyes and butter-colored hair, with one reddish-pink hand resting on the shoulder of a large yellow-brown, square-nosed dog, the breed of which had times thrown Gertie into long fits of pondering. Her mother had always considered too fine for feet, and kept it in front of the flower stand where almost no one ever stepped for fear of knocking over a plant or breaking a frond off of the swelling fern. Gertie fidgeted in her chair and touched the knife in her apron pocket, then quickly jerked her straying fingers away. Her mother hated whittling, even in her father, and in a girl it had seemed almost a sin. Strange how she could whittle, but never did learn how to do a bit of fancy work. In spite of all her mother's teaching in the little spare time Gertie had away from farm work, even her plain sewing was poor, all but the patching. Her mother often pointed out that her buttonholes looked like pig eyes, and she made all her own dresses too big and too long. She realized her mother had left off crying and was looking at her. She turned eagerly, trying to smile, even when her mother said, "Gert, did you let anybody see you coming down the big road looking that way? You'll have beggar lice and Spanish needles all over the place. And why didn't you take off your coat? What ails you anyhow? You act like you was a stranger." Gertie got up and jerked off her coat, and knocking the faded flower from the large begonia as she did so, she stood then staring into the fire and unconsciously fell to pulling her fingers till the joints popped, a childhood habit that had always slipped upon her when trouble overtook her with empty hands. Her mother, just beginning an account of her wartime trials with the burying of thread, interrupted herself to scold, Gert, don't you know that drives me crazy? Gertie's frantic glance struggled with the curtains. Maybe her mother could be led to talk about the curtains. They looked new, but were they? They looked exactly like all the other curtains in this room she could remember. Thin and white and edged with her mother's crochet work. But the starch-laced, fragile appearing as rows of snow crystals sewed upon the curtains, only brought back Battle John Brown, stampeding the souls of his flock to Christ with his twin whips of hell and God. She could feel the torture of the lace again, as it used to be on those long, hot summer Sundays of her girlhood, when she would sit by her sister Meg in the meeting house and listen to Battle John Brand. His hell would quiver like the heat waves through the meeting house, and she would sit, trying desperately to think of other things, but never succeeding. She could smell her own flesh burning, rising like an incense to God in heaven, with her mother who was forever listening down the golden stairs, but never hearing her daughter cry, I love Battle John's God. I love the Sunday clothing my poor, weakly mother worked so hard to make for me. She never, no matter how hot the coals or bright the flames that Battle John made, was able to say such things, but sat on in sweaty-handed guilt and misery. Was she like Judas, foreordained to sin, she wondered. She knew, but was unable to imagine, that the torture of hell was a million times worse than the torture of her Sunday clothes. The starched, embroidered white dress of dotted Swiss, always edged with her mother's crochet, seemed by its very daintiness to make her own body, brown and big bone, big muscle, briar scratch from a man's work she did on the farm, even more ugly. Her thighs that could endure the jolting of a mule's back or long hours on the iron seat of the iron-wheeled mowing machine cried to her in church with unceasing agony at their confinement in the encircling brands of knitted or crocheted lace and tucks, all starched and ironed until even the tooth edge seemed so much iron and cutting was into her sweating flesh. More stretched lace chafed at her breast, her back, and her chigger-bitten armpits. The pain and discomfort of these, added to the too tight shoes and the layers of starched slips and petticoats, made the long sittings under Battle John a greater agony than any pain she had ever known. The cuckoo in the clock on her mother's wall whirled and creaked, for it was getting old, and then it leaped from its little house and cried 11 times. Gertie had seldom heard a more pleasant sound. She started toward the kitchen, but paused, her hand on the doorknob, and asked somewhat timidly, for she had never been a cook to match either her mother or Meg, Mom, couldn't I get dinner this evening and save you the trouble? Her mother considered as she juggled a bottle of pills so as to make only one of the pill fall from the bottle. She succeeded, swallowed the pill, gagged, shook her head at Gertie's suggestion that she get her a glass of water. Lord, Gert, I reckon in times like this you can cook just about as good as anybody. She paused to gag again before continuing. Many's the time I've wished here lately that I had a stingy hand like you with lard and sugar you always had since you got Clovis. We run out of our own lard back in August, and that ration didn't hardly give me enough for biscuits until hog-tilling time, when I'll have to cook with butter, and butter seasoning makes me sick, gives me a headache. I tried frying a chicken in butter, but it tasted like beef to me. I can't eat one bite but the liver. Gertie stood in the doorway while her mother went into a long pondering on whether she should or shouldn't let Gertie get dinner. She did feel weakly, but on the other hand, somebody would surely come on such a pretty Sunday. She finished at last with the decision in favor of Gertie, who went quickly into the kitchen, closing the door behind her. She hung her coat on a peg and gave the hem below the torn pocket a swift, critical glance. It looked flat and empty like the tail of her old coat. She pinched it between her thumb and her finger and was reassured by the soft, whispering crackle of money. She paused an instant, looking around the great room, and she glanced into the wide-mouthed fireplace where her great-grandmother had baked the bread and cooked all the Kendrick food, and smiled a little on the unusually large Dutch oven, one her father had always prized. His grandfather had brought it back from Alabama one early spring when he and the other men in the settlement had returned from driving their hogs to market in the south across the mountains. She crossed the kitchen to the great cook stove with its high, curving legs and rolled back the warming oven door. She looked at the platter there with 2 pieces of ham left from breakfast, 2 fried eggs, and one on the end a little mound of biscuit. It was for an instant as if it had been there before she was married, when this was home, and if she grew hungry at any time of the day or night, she only had to come to the warming oven or to go to the cherry cupboard, where a selection of jam and jellies were canned, and baked goods, especially gingerbread, were kept. Endlessly replenishing the kitchen like a widow's barrel were the smokehouse, the spring house, and the root house. Behind these were the hogs and cattle and sheep on the range, the timber on the hillside, the little coal mines worked by paid miners, but good for cash money. And under everything was the big South Fork of the Cumberland that each year in the time of tides laid a thick, rich coating of black earth on the already rich land of her father's river-bottom fields, sheltered from the fiercest currents of the river so that the sand and gravel never came on the flood tide, only black silt setting slowly down from the quiet backwaters. There'd been no fried meat left at her table in a long time. She turned quickly to the wood box filled with the only kind of wood her mother could abide, split maple, hickory, and oak, cut green and seasoned, with one small corner given up to split red cedar root for kindling. When the fire was burning well, the stove cranking with the rising heat, she hurried soundlessly through the outside door and down the lane toward the thin red rise of smoke that rose from the blacksmith shop, a little log building that in the days of her grandfather had served much of the settlement, but was seldom used now, except by her father for his own work. She pushed open the door, but paused a moment looking. In the dim light, her father seemed a stranger, some old man, older than her father, who was hardly 60, too deaf to hear the opening of the door. His hair had the thin, straggly look of old man's hair, and his shoulders bent above the freshly made axe handle he was smoothing with a piece of broken glass, had the tired look of an old man's shoulders. He scraped on, smoothing the wood, not looking up until she stepped across the threshold, questioning more than greeting. "Pop? Pop?" The axe handle fell from his knees and he got up, and with a piece of glass still clutched in one hand, he pulled her tightly against him, whispering, "Gertie, Gertie." He held her away from him, looking into her face, repeating, "Gertie, Gertie." The never-spoken knowledge of childhood that her father, not her mother, was the weak and pitiful one, the one who needed help, came back to her. But now, as then, she could say nothing of what was in her heart, nor speak of Henley, who, in dying, had taken with him the Kendrick name and the Kendrick land. In a moment she was able to say, "Pop, I've been a-worrying on how you was a-making out with your leg in this rainy fall weather." Pretty good, he said. "I was lucky to have Reuben to help here in the fall work, and I got the Kramer boys for a few days." "I heard they'd went that way," she said, picking up his axe handle and heffing it. He nodded. "The oldest ain't 17, but they're big as men, and they took off for Muncie, and they'll kill theirselves in one of them factories," he sighed. "There won't be men enough around here for us to dig graves. Looks like they could have left us Clovis. He could have kept the mail a-running." She tried to smile. "Why, Pop, many the time I've heard you tell about how the women managed in the war of 1812 when there wasn't a man above 14 left in the settlement. I can do a man's work." She studied the axe handle. "I kind of kept a hoping they'd leave Clovis. I maybe ought to have him go to Oak Ridge or some factory. I think he wanted to. He hated to leave his old people and sell that truck, but he would have gone. Mostly it was me. I was afeard he wouldn't want me and the young'uns to follow him to the city. He patted her shoulder. Clovis, he'll be all right in the army. She nodded. He'll be all right. Remembering to say it again. He'll be all right. She and her father had stood together in the barn. Late spring it had been then, with the sun rising far northward. They had stood in the pale spring dawn with milk buckets in their hands and listened to Clovis's truck as it took Henley to the railroad, and they repeated to each other, Henley, he'll be all right. She watched him as he took the axe handle, settled himself slowly and cautiously into the chair, and commenced scraping again. Looking over his spectacles at the oak wood, she saw the glass make a deeper mark than it should have, scratching the oak. He, too, was thinking of the other all right. In a moment, she was able to ask, How's your leg, Pop, and your rheumatism? Oh, not bad, nothing to speak of. He reached and gave the bellows string 3 quick pulls that brought first red glowing life and then pale flames to the charcoal in the forge. I've been kind of baking myself, and that helps. It ain't so bad. Well, why you set inside, Pop? It's just now beginning to get warm in the sun. A forge fire's no good for baking your legs and back. Oh, Lord, he said, looking through the little window to the hills across the river. You know how it is. The mess of my whittling always aggravates your poor mother. And seems like since this trouble, I always got to be a whittling or a chewing and a spitting, too. And your poor mother, the smell of it just seeing me spit. Why, the other night I was sitting by the fire and she had such a gagging spell, she might come fainting. How's the little one? I wanted to ride over to see him, but your mom's been so bad I couldn't have. Oh, he's fine, Gertie said, steadying his hand scraping the oak. Seemed like it wasn't steady, but maybe she only imagined it. Like a minute ago when he stood up and his eyes had not seemed quite level with her own. No, she didn't imagine it. She had been little looking up at her father, the tallest man in the world, 6'4", then grown, looking into his eyes when it seemed his eyes alone were the only eyes in the world high as her own, and now the eyes were lower. She realized she was pulling her fingers again, but did not stop. Pop, I ain't right certain. Well, I'm almost certain, but soon as Clovis is in the army, there'll be a money I can depend on for a while, and I'll move closer in the Tipton place? He asked, and his eyes were eager and glad like Reuben's. It's good, and Gertie! Gertie! They both jumped like guilty children at hearing her mother's calling, exasperated and shrill. Gertie hastily opened the door, but much to her relief and surprise, her mother, in a fresh crocheted cap and apron, seemed pleased and relieved to find her with her father. She pushed Gertie back into the blacksmith shop and then closed the door with great air of mystery. The Reverend Brand is coming down the road, she whispered, and this is the last chance I'll have to see you by yourself all day. You've always been awful good to us, in a way, Gertie, she went on. Pulling a handful of bills from her pocket, she opened the pocket wide, peeped in and took another, and then held out the loosely crumbled handful. Take 'em, they're for you. Your father and me has talked it over. You heaped us sight back in your younger days. You stayed with us longer than most girls, and me and your pop, we get along somehow. Gertie stepped backward, staring at the money. Law, Mom, you and Pop, you bein' needing it worse than Clovis and me. Her father smiled at her. It's Henley's cattle money, he said. He wanted you to have it, all of it. And he gave a quick glance at the bills, as if he would count them. Failing, he glanced sharply at his wife, who held the money half hidden in her hand. His last wish was all of it, he said, insistent. His dying wish, her mother said, in the unmoved but intentionally dramatic tone she might have used to arouse interest in some unusual bit of neighborhood gossip. He writ to me not long afore they took him across the waters, that if anything happened to him, to help Gertie. You raised him, he said. Gertie choked and moved hastily backwards, knocking her shoulder against the nail shelf as she did so. Her mother sighed heavily. It ain't like me and your poor father have long for this world. But there's insurance money coming in every month, her father said. Well, maybe it's like he always said, her mother went on, shoving the bills into Gertie's apron pocket. If you hadn't been big enough to help on the farm while he was a-growing up, we'd have lost the place. Now take it, she said, and turned and walked away. Oh, Mom, Gertie said, and her bleak face becoming a hideous thing, breaking into twisted wrinkles and grimaces as she began to cry, giving all her big being to crying wholeheartedly like a hurt child. Cassie, who had peeped in when her grandmother opened the door, had never seen her mother cry. She was terrified of tears and buried her face in Gertie's apron. The child stood shivering, clutching her mother's leg when her grandmother broke into a mighty wail of weeping, screaming as she flung her apron over her head and hurried towards the house. Gert, think of me. I can't stand to see you cry. If a Henley's going hurts you so, think of how your poor mother must feel. Gertie cried on, her hands pressed against her face, the crumbled money spilling from her pocket just as she had been unable to tell her father any word of how she felt for him. She was tongueless to tell her mother that sorrow for Henley did not cause her tears. But her mother's unexpected gratitude, never mentioned through all these years. Maybe her mother did love her. What a sin to have doubted it ever. She cried afresh over her own hardness of heart. Clovis was going to war, and she thought only of money. She rushed out of the shop and away from the long, quick strides, unmindful of Cassie's frightened eyes peeping up from the apron, or the small hands pulling on her skirt. At last she noticed the drag on her walking and picked up the child and strode on, her feet following a path of escape into childhood, up the hill to the spring. She was halfway there before she noticed that Cassie's arms were clasped so tightly around her neck they were choking her. And while the child shivered and trembled like a young lamb in January rain, as she said over and over in a low, terrified voice, "Don't cry, Mama, please, don't cry." The shameful realization came to Gertie that she was scaring her own child the way her mother had used to scare her. "I won't cry no more," she said. "I ain't hurt. I'm all right. 'Less you choke me to death with your hugging." Miss Cassie hugged her mommy to death. Now, wouldn't that make a pretty piece for the paper? Cassie smiled and patted her mother's hair, but was troubled still. "Where were you going, Mom?" "To the spring. You know the spring, your granny's spring." "But you ain't got no bucket." "Just to look around and get a drink," Gertie said, after a moment's wondering on why she did come. She realized she was clutching the money, and through all her sorrow, there came a panicky fear that she'd lost some of it, and that she didn't know how much there really had been. She hastily slid Cassie to the ground and counted it, smoothing each bill, laying them evenly over one another, $15, $20 bills. She wished she had her coat. She would sit in the sun up where no one could see her and count all of it. More already than John had paid for the Tipton place. She wouldn't have to wait. She wouldn't have to depend on Clovis. She wouldn't have to ask old Uncle John for credit. She wouldn't have to ask anybody for anything. She hurried a few steps further up the hill, her eyes searching hungrily ahead. When she had gone high enough so that she could see the gray-brown roof of the old log house on the Tipton place rising above the cedars on the Rocky Creek bank, she stopped and stood a long time looking. Such a safe and sheltered place, she thought. If a body didn't know it was there, she would have never noticed it among the leafless trees. It was close to her father, and her own, all her own. Never, never would she have to move again. Never see that weary, sullen look on Reuben's face that came when they worked in a field, not their own, and he knew that half of that sweat went to another man. She heard her mother calling her again and remembered it was past dinner getting time, and the preacher was coming for dinner. The fire in the cook stove would have burned away. And where was Cassie? She saw her at last, far up in the field, the hickory doll on one arm, while the other she fought something with a dried stickweed longer than she was tall. Gertie heard her cries of "Suey! Suey!" and saw the stickweed break in the air. But for all her fierce fighting, Cassie was losing ground before the enemy, running backwards at times on the hill. Gertie called to her, and Cassie whirled about, dropping the stickweed, and came running, laughing. Halfway to Gertie, she glanced over her shoulder and then ran faster, screaming, "Mommy, Mommy, throw out some ears of corn. These wild hogs can eat them, and they stood on my little young'un. They've overtaken me." Gertie made great motions of throwing out ears of corn to hungry hogs and stamped her feet, crying, "Sweet!" then held out her arms to a flying Cassie. She caught her up with a cry of, "Woman, you oughtn't to take your little young'uns out through a bunch of wild hogs that way anyway." "There weren't so many," Cassie said, settling herself on her mother's shoulders. "Callie Lou chased them all but the two old sows off up the creek." "That Callie Lou sure is brave," said Gertie, hurrying down the hill. Cassie hugged her mother, and Callie Lou was gone. "Mom," she whispered as they neared the house, "I heard Grandma when she come a-crying out to the porch. Was that why you was a-crying? Because Uncle Henley can't never go up to Jesus?" "Pshaw," Gertie said. "A body don't have to go to Jesus. He's right down here on earth all the time." "Have you seen him, Mom?" Gertie considered, looking up the hill. "Well, it's kind of like you see Callie Lou." "You mean he's got black curly hair and black eyes like Callie Lou?" "No. When I see him, he's walking over the hill. He just looks like a good man." "Like a preacher in suit clothes and carrying the Bible?" "No. He wears overalls like a carpenter. He makes things like your grandpa." "Was he carrying an axe to cut an axe handle?" "Well, I didn't see his tools. He'd been in the woods, though, a-looking for some time, for he was carrying a big branch and red leaves. I figured he'd cut down an old holler black gum tree to make some beehives, and the leaves was so pretty he took 'em with him." She gave the down-hanging feet and legs of the child a quick squeeze. "Jesus walks the earth, and we're going to have us a little piece of heaven right here on earth. Your pop has to go away, but he'll be back, and he'll be all right."